Yeah, I know. I think the big thing that uh, uh, is a problem with the way that we conceive of world history, the way that we categorize religious traditions, lies in the word paganism. And you can kind of see this in the popular criticism that you see of liturgical tradition. People say that's a pagan tradition. You know, sometimes you'll find that kind of group of people say, oh, Christmas is pagan, or Christmas trees are pagan. But then when you get into the question of what actually they mean by that, they don't mean it's pagan, they mean it's Germanic. And my criticism of that, the point that I think we really need to appreciate, is that pre-Christian Gentile culture is not identical to what we call paganism. Because in the Bible, there is a whole history of the Gentile nations and an explanation for why they are the way that they are. That means you can have such a thing as a non Israelite Gentile, which is kind of a tautology, but you can have such a thing as a righteous Gentile in the Old Testament who at the same time is not a pagan, is not an idolater. And then that raises the question when we're talking about Hellenistic philosophy, we're talking about the philosophical traditions of antiquity. Are we talking about pagan philosophy? Because if we are, I think that that's a bit of a problem. And we see people use the phrase pagan philosophy, but I don't think that that's a good phrase to use. What we're really doing is we're talking about the traditions of antiquity, which are more faithful to that covenant by which they were administered, that is the Noachic covenant. Uh, and the pagan aspect of it is the aspect which is idolatrous. And that is a corruption on their culture, not the core and center of it. It's not what defines who they are. It's actually a corruption of who they are.
And
And that's kind of related, I think, to the people say things like the Bible is a human book. And yes, trivially speaking, that's true. But what they want to get at when they say that is the Bible is an imperfect book, the implication being to be human is to be imperfect. And that's actually the inverse of the truth. And I think it's kind of an analogous issue that we're dealing with when we look at the history of ancient cultures and we equate what makes a Gentile culture Gentile to pagan.
so this, what I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm assuming this would tie into the point that you make. That's a great point about that the original religion was not polytheism. There's a sort of academic assumption on the part of secular ancient history and humanist views that the ancient world was necessarily animistic, polytheistic, and then evolves into this sort of monotheism after whoever, Egyptians,
Yeah.
certain pharaohs, the Jews, whatever. And then now today we have evolved past monotheism into science and scientism. This is a very popular way to
Yeah.
categorize history, which is very arbitrary. And so, does this tie into your uh, great apologetic point from Genesis that actually the original religion was monotheistic?
Yeah, yeah. And the thing is, on the one hand, this is something that academics believe, but on the other hand, actually, those who specialize in the actual history of religious traditions don't say things like this. Um, Basically, it was in the 19th century that you have the so-called history of religion school, which develops this etiology or origin story of religion, where they say it begins with animism or spirits abroad in nature. Then it develops into polytheism. You've got gods distinct from the world, but there's a multiplicity of gods. Then you have henotheism, which is a totally useless category, which is where you worship one god, but there are many gods. And then finally you have monotheism, which is there's only one god. But actually, when we talk about biblical monotheism, the Bible never, to my memory, it never says something like there is one God. It always says God is one. And those are two subtly distinct things. Because to say that God is one is to say that he unifies everything in himself. In other words, he is the ultimate principle of all reality, including those other beings whom we call the gods, heavenly beings, saints, angels, so on and so forth. Because there's basically no philosophical tradition, world religion, which would say there is only one heavenly being. It is rather that those traditions we call monotheistic religions say that there is a single ultimate principle of reality, not multiple principles of reality. And when we, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was an anthropologist. His name was Wilhelm Schmidt. He was a Catholic, and he wrote this enormous 12-volume series on the original religion of humankind. And basically, he said, okay, so we have this hypothesis here, but it hasn't actually been tested against the evidence. It's kind of just used as a way to frame the evidence. Let's actually go into the empirical data and ask, what does it look like the earliest religion was? And what he points out is those cultures around the world which seem to be um, less different than their ancient form. So, for example, we acknowledge, like, after the flood, people are still recovering. They're basically hunters and gatherers, right? It's interesting in Genesis, which is very soon after the flood, you see the patriarchs doing a lot with caves. So like they're still transitioning out of the cavemen stage, so they still have this connection with caves. It's kind of an interesting detail that one doesn't often notice. But when you look at those cultures which are still hunting and gathering, or are nomadic but they circulate around
This is where
geography.
we get the whole history of Encino Man, right?
Of what?
Encino Man, Pauly Shore, Brendan Fraser.
I'm culturally illiterate,
Oh, I'm
so
sorry. It's a dumb '90s movie about a caveman that comes out of, like, they dig up a caveman in L.A. I'm sorry, it was a dumb joke. Go ahead.
okay, yeah, no, it's a flaw in me.
You should watch it.
Um,
It's pretty bad.
yeah. So, um, if you look at those cultures which resemble that most ancient form of human life, they are more likely to be monotheistic. In other words, they are more likely to have active engagement with this single principle through which all things exist. So, for example, the Maasai in Africa.
Hmm.
I remember when I went to Africa and we were on like the safari, we'd see the animals, but then there were like Maasai tribes, and they had like an agreement with the group, and they would like talk about their culture. They had like multiple wives. They said, "You know why we need to have multiple wives? It's because we shepherd around these different villages. We need a wife in every village." So it was kind of funny because it's like, well, of course, this is what you do. But anyway,
By the way,
they talked
that
about
Maasai, that comes up in the carnivore issue because they're an interesting case where they don't have vegetables in their diet, and so they're often brought forth as examples of people who have been able to survive without greens.
mhm.
And they've been eating, I think, an all meat based diet for centuries and centuries. Anyway, they're just this was a weird case that you brought them up.
Yeah, yeah. So I remember they talked about a being whom they called the Sky God, and
Hmm.
it didn't mean anything to me at the time. But actually, now I realize that what they called the Sky God is actually the biblical name for the Gentile worship of God. So you'll see in Genesis 14, Ezra, Nehemiah, the book of Daniel, Gentiles from around the world in the Bible will address the Creator as God of heaven. Okay, so Israel worships God as the Lord, the four-letter tetragrammaton, that's his covenantal name. But then there's the God of heaven. He's called the God of heaven because he is the most high. He is supreme. He is the one in terms of which everything else exists, which means he has authority over everything else. Because if he's the one from whom everything comes, he is the one who ultimately determines the way in which everything continues to exist. And Genesis 1:14 says that God created the sun, moon, and stars to rule the day and the night. And so when one is talking about God who is distinct from everything else in terms of his sovereignty, one calls him the God of heaven. That's why if you look at flags from around the world, national symbols will have sun, moon, stars. They'll have this celestial imagery on it.
Hmm.
It's because this kind of symbolic archetype is a very widespread
Right.
feature of many cultures. Um, but the really interesting thing is these people groups who have this earlier form of human culture tend to worship at a much higher rate the supreme God. And not only that, it's not just that they identify him as the creator, the supreme one, the one through whom everything else exists. They also tend to believe in creation ex nihilo. So people say, oh, the earliest Israelite traditions, they didn't talk about creation ex nihilo. Genesis 1:1 isn't about creation ex nihilo. Well, if you look at the concept of creation ex nihilo, contrary to popular belief, this is not just a Jewish and a Christian thing. You will find this in human traditions, and they tend to be the monotheistic ones. They tend to be the ones which talk about the supreme God.
I didn't
But
know
it's not
that.
only
Yeah.
it's not only that. It's that you will find they associate the supreme God with the sky or the heavens all
Hmm.
around the world. In Mesoamerica, of all places, where they are idolaters of idolaters, they don't worship him so much. He's kind of a distant lord in the far reaches of the heavens, but they acknowledge he's real and they call him the heart of heaven. He is the one who created everything. He's the one who sent the flood. But we haven't been able to get in touch with him for a long time. And that story as well is very common in the traditions of antiquity and of more hunter and gatherer
Is
cultures.
this also true in regard to Native American myths, the Great Spirit, or do you
The
know?
Great Spirit, yeah, the
Okay.
Great Spirit is in North America, North American Indian cultures. The Great Spirit tends to be the name for the supreme
Okay.
god. And
Interesting.
one might think, well, what does that have to do with the sky? But spirit, of course, means wind, heaven. and we see that God is associated with the storm, the whirlwind in the Bible. In the book of Job, he's the whirlwind. We see that God is associated with the sun. In Egypt, Re, though later, of course, it gets mixed up with all kinds of other things. If you look at the beginning of the New Kingdom, which I actually think is contemporary with David and Solomon, you see all this stuff which resembles the wisdom literature in Israel. We know Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh. Beginning of the New Kingdom, the worship of Amun-Re becomes a lot more exclusive. It becomes a lot more associated with transcendence, and of course, he is the God of heaven, the supreme God. But different cities in Egypt are uniting into a single polity, and each of them has a different name for the supreme God, and so you have something like Amun-Re. But this is true for a wide variety of cultures. In Egypt, he's Shangdi, the emperor of heaven. Sometimes they just call him Tian, or heaven. And this is really interesting because not only do you have a kind of similar philosophical belief in the supreme God, it's that you have the same title. You have things like temples, priests, sacrifice. Where did this come from? Because we take this for granted, and it's a question that we're so used to this being true. I don't think that naturalists have fully grappled with what a big problem this is. Why does everybody do this thing where they build an altar, they kill an animal, they pour its blood on an altar? That's a really weird ritual. It's illegal in the United States. But why is it so common? Where did this come from? The Bible tells us where it came from. And it's not just a Near Eastern thing. It's in China. It's in ancient America. It's in Mesopotamia. It's in sub-Saharan Africa. It is everywhere. And what's most amazing, I think, the actual temples themselves are, structurally speaking, very similar to each other. With the image of the ziggurat, for example, it is ubiquitous, and the symbolic interpretation of the ziggurat is very similar. It's a microcosm. It's an architectural representation of the universe. So, where did all of this stuff come from? But what it tells you is that before Christ, we can't just say, "Oh, they were all pagans. They're idolaters." No, there were lots of Gentiles who worshipped God without idolatry, or mostly without idolatry.